Welcome to Muddy's Whitetail 101. Last week I talked about casting a wide net, which is the first phase of the patterning process. And this week I'm going to talk about the next phase. Before I do that, let me tell you what I found on my cameras. I had 6 of the Procam 12s out, and I found 4 different bucks on those cameras that I would shoot this fall. So that's a pretty good ratio for me. The last few years have been kind of slim around here with the EHD die-off that we had in 2012. But we're starting to see that rebound now. And like I always tell everybody, it takes 5 years to grow a 5-year-old buck. So we're on year 4 of the recovery. So we're just now starting to catch up again and see more of these fully mature bucks in the population. I was excited about one deer in particular, and he's a buck that we've nicknamed Lefty. And last year he was about the same size, maybe not quite as massive, not the same number of tines on the left antler, but overall I expected this deer was going to make a big jump, but he didn't. He's still a great deer, but he just didn't make the kind of jump that I expected. So that's phase 1, and finding Lefty was the fruits of my phase 1 efforts. So now going into phase 2, my process is going to change just a little bit. I'll probably stay more or less in those same areas where Lefty is at. Phase 2 is really defining that buck's range, because just knowing one spot where that deer shows up, that's really good information if it's very huntable, and on every wind condition you can get in there and hunt that spot, which is pretty rare. So we really need more options. In order to get more options on this buck, I have to know where all this deer goes. So that's my next step, and I've put cameras out in a few other locations hoping to pick up this buck in some of the spots, maybe a couple hundred yards in either direction from where I picked him up initially. So now I'm starting to make a ring around that spot with cameras. So that's my phase 2. My phase 3 is going to be something that we can talk about as the series continues, but that has more to do with picking out the exact timing. Like, when do you make that hunt? Right now we're still trying to define where this deer lives. Once we've got that nailed down, then it's going to be all about when do you make the move. And that's more the fine-tuning, or the phase 3 of the patterning process. Talk a little bit more today too about food sources. We're seeing the beans turning from green to yellow, and in some cases all the way to brown. And this is that point when the deer really come off the beans. They've been eating them all summer. Now they just aren't that palatable anymore. They've been eating the leaves. Everybody kind of thinks, well, they're eating the beans, but they're not eating the beans yet. They're eating the leaves. And when the leaves turn yellow, they stop eating them. But then they'll come back again to the beans in a few weeks when the pods themselves start to dry down. About the time the farmers are going into the fields to combine their beans, that's when you'll see the deer start to move back to the beans again, because the pods have dried down and the beans inside the pods have dried down. And then they eat the entire pod, bean and all. So they eat 2 different parts of the bean plant. So it's just something to keep in mind. There's a period here of transition where if you've been seeing the deer on beans getting all excited for opening day, you might be disappointed if you've got a tree stand there and the beans have already turned to a yellow or even dropped the leaves. So what are they feeding on? Right now it's going to be acorns. We've got a bumper crop of acorns here. The white oaks aren't dropping heavily, but the reds and the blacks are just dropping by the bushel load. And that's where we're finding the deer at this time. They're in the timber underneath the oak trees. We're also on the very front end of when the deer start feeding on corn. They wait until the kernels on the ears start to dry down, and you'll see the kernels dent. And when the kernels start to dent and get hard rather than just being soft and spongy, that's when the deer will start to feed on the corn. It's just been really hot though. Under these conditions, the deer aren't nearly as apt to go to corn. They're more likely to stick with the green foods like your clovers and your alfalfas, and of course, like I said, your acorns. But as it starts to get cooler this fall, you'll start to see that shift more and more towards corn. So that's starting now. So keep an eye on the food sources. Water should still be a key. I mean, it's been hot and dry for the last 10 days now. There's some rain in the forecast throughout the Midwest, but it's spotty. So you might be in a location where you don't get a shower for a couple of weeks and you've got these high temperatures. Opening day rolls around. The very best spot on the whole property may be a watering hole. So keep that in mind. Well, that's it for the deer discussion for this week. Now I want to talk about some tree stand shooting tips. I'm just going to pick one. And this is something that you might not have thought about. It's something that kind of snuck up on me. If you're in a tree stand, everybody knows you're supposed to bend at the waist in order to create that downward shooting angle. When the deer is close, you have to make a pretty severe bend at the waist. because you want to maintain the 90-degree angle between your bow arm and your upper body, because that's what you practice on the range. You want to adapt that to the tree. You don't want to just drop your arm, because that'll change your relationship between your anchor point, your eye, and your peep sight, and can really mess up your shooting. That's one that most people know, but what you don't realize is as you're bending to the side, a lot of times we bend forward. And when we do that, we cant our bow just very slightly. If you're right-handed, you cant your bow to the right. And the bow is going to shoot in whatever direction you lean it. So if you lean in the bow to the right, it's going to shoot to the right. So when you're bending at the waist, don't cheat on that and bend forward at the waist, bend to the side at the waist. And the best way to make sure whether you're doing it correctly or not is to have a bubble level on your sight. That way when you come over the top, you can look at that bubble level real quick and make sure. It can be pretty dramatic. At 20 yards, you could be as much as 2 to 3 inches off, or even more, if you lean that bow pretty significantly over to the right. So that's my one shooting tip for this week. Hopefully you picked up something there. I've enjoyed visiting with you about the tuning process. I'm excited about the deer that are showing up on the farm. And I'll keep walking you through that as we talk about the behavior of the deer, how the behavior changes, how we have to adapt as hunters, and some of the steps that we can take to be one step ahead of the action. Well, we'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Muddy's Whitetail 101.